I'm happy to introduce Brian Belcher from Royal Roads University.
Good afternoon. Is the mic working? Yeah. So thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I have a research program that focuses on whether and how research actually makes a difference in the world. And I work primarily in an international research for development context. So it's quite a different story, but I think it will be interesting, and I hope it will be useful for you to sort of reflect on some of the lessons which may apply back to your own institutions and your own fields of research. It comes from this area that Stephen was talking about relating to Dan Sarowitz's article on saving science, and a lot of discussion that's going into evolving research approaches in order that research is more useful and more used, and that it actually makes a difference in the world. Am I doing that?
No.
Okay. So research assessment, there's a surprising number of words that start with A in this list. We've been talking a lot about appraisal, so appraisal for applications, appraisal for tenure and appointments and so on. In the field that I work, it's a lot about accountability. It's a lot about demonstrating that the research is making a difference so that you can satisfy the taxpayers essentially often. It's about research funding allocation, also advocacy, and I'm most interested in the analysis part of it. What can we learn about whether and how research actually makes a difference? The story I'm going to talk about is the Consultative Group on International Agriculture Research, which is an international research consortium started in the 70s with funding from Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, that started out doing genetics research on high-yielding agricultural crops, and it was really responsible for the Green Revolution. Over the years, it's expanded to cover a broader range of natural resources and agricultural crops. Currently, there's 15 research centers, 16 consortium research programs that are integrated across centers and other research partners, something like 8,000 scientists, researchers, technicians, and staff, and a budget of about $850 million. So if you think about the premier research institution for food security and natural resource management, it's about the size of a medium to small American university. The interesting thing is this reform process that happened and really changed the way research is evaluated in this research system. In about 2009, 2010, they started talking about changing the way research was evaluated. In the past, there was this idea that as long as we do high-quality science, that science will go out into the world and will make a difference. And it was highly effective with the Green Revolution crops and many of the other technologies, which could be packaged in a seed or a farming system or something like that. So it was easy, relatively easy, to move the technologies into practice. As the system expanded, there was much more focus on a broader range, including a lot of social science. And so they recognized that different approaches were needed. So this reform process was meant to incentivize and encourage more and broader partnerships, so not just with other research organizations, but with NGOs, with policymakers up and down the impact pathway, increased emphasis on results-based management, really ambitious targets, like one of the targets was 100,000 people lifted out of poverty by 2030, 5 million hectares of forest with avoided deforestation. And the big thing was this idea of co-responsibility for outcomes. So in the past, scientists, individual research agencies were held responsible for doing good quality science and disseminating that science. Now they were saying, and also, you need to think about how is this actually going to get used. So what happened? First response, fear, confusion, resentment. Scientists said, we cannot do that. We can't guarantee, we can't bridge that gap between our research and hundreds of thousands of people lifted out of poverty. And as they thought about it, they also started to realize that if we're going to do that, there's a whole bunch of other things we need to do, and we as scientists, are not trained to do those other things, those outreach and partnerships and so on. And moreover, if we could, we haven't got time, it will completely diffuse our efforts over a large range of other things. So then they started to think about, how can we actually do this? How can we organize the system so that we can achieve some of these higher level changes? So one of them is about conceptualizing and defining research effects in a systems context. I'll talk about that in more detail. Another was actually being more explicit and deliberate about thinking through how a research project or a program would actually contribute to a change process. In other words, what was that process? What were the impact pathways? Who are the actors that are involved in that process? And how do we do our work in order to encourage that process to take place? Increased inter and transdisciplinary research. So this is research that starts with a social problem and organizes science around that social problem in order to hopefully try to solve it. More theory-based evaluation approaches, so meaning ex post, after the project is completed, how can we know if we've actually achieved what we aimed to achieve? We're doing that a lot with using a theory of change as an analytical framework and doing empirical research to see, are these elements of the theory of change actually being realized? Redefining research quality beyond the disciplinary definition. So when we cross disciplinary bounds, when we start to engage stakeholders, what is the nature of good quality research? So we need new ways of thinking about that. And then some of the things we talked about in our working groups this morning, what can we do to support and facilitate that transition? When we looked at terms and definitions, we were working again in an international development context, so a colleague and I started to look at all the different ways these terms are used, and it was full of ambiguity. There was really no way to know what is an outcome, what is an impact, and what's the difference between them. Typically, they tended to be defined in relative terms, so short-term versus long-term, immediate versus distal, small scale versus large scale, and so on. And many definitions would include elements where all possible aspects were included. So short-term, or let's say negative and positive and various things. So the definitions that were really commonly in use were not useful. So we said, is there a way that we can focus rather than on these relative aspects on the nature of the change itself? This is a really simplistic logic model of a change process where research contributes to knowledge generation, which is disseminated, taken up, and used. Ultimately, hopefully, the world is a better place. Everybody who thinks about this knows it's wrong, but I go to a lot of meetings, and this is the default model that people always seem to fall back on. If we look at it, the idea of research impact that we're talking about is quite a small part of the uptake and use part. This is not to scale. But essentially, we're talking to other researchers and hoping to influence the way science proceeds. And for that reason, there's been a lot of emphasis in universities and research institutes on the dissemination side of knowledge mobilization. Get that package of knowledge, that completed package of knowledge out into the world so that it gets used. When sort of in everyday language, when people talk about impact, they mean everything that happens as a result of some kind of an intervention. So it's a wide range of changes. There's much more discussion nowadays about societal impact. So who is using it in society and how is it being used? The Research Excellence Framework in the UK is a really interesting example where they said part of our assessment process will be to explicitly look at how researchers are, how their research is being used in the world. What kind of societal impact can we demonstrate? And then the thing that we were dealing with in this consultative group on international agricultural research is that the funders of the research, when they talked about impact, they were really talking about mission level impact. They were talking about poverty alleviated, food and nutrition security improved, environmental condition improved. So how do we reconcile these different meanings of impact? So we instead started to think about it in a systems framework and think about what is it that the research project or program or the research process in any case has control over it. We've got a sphere of control where we're producing outputs which go into the world, and really the only way those outputs make a difference is that somebody else uses them and takes an action or creates a policy, or in some way leads to a change that will, over time and with collective contributions, lead to these higher level changes. But we found it really useful when we were thinking about our research to say, okay, which part of this are we in control of, and how do we evaluate that? And so that's here. That's the monitoring, evaluation, and learning for research quality. Are we doing this in a way that will result in high quality research? And we're defining research quality more broadly than in strictly disciplinary terms. We're thinking about, are we producing knowledge and information that will be relevant to the intended users, that will be credible in scientific terms, that will be considered to be legitimate in the sense that the people who go to use it will feel like their values have been represented and taken into account. And then we get into the sphere of influence, which is really as far as we can get in this process. We're thinking about who are the users and are they doing something differently as a result of the research. And so here it's monitoring and evaluation and learning for research effectiveness. We're looking for evidence that the research is being used, that it's changing the way other actors do their work in a way that hopefully logically will lead on to these higher level changes. And ultimately we hope that those collectively, those changes will lead to the higher level changes. In terms of in the sphere of interest, in terms of. So I'll quickly move on to these definitions. Am I out of time?
Yeah, you're completely out of time.
Okay.
Long out of time.
My apologies.
Yes.
So anyway, I've got a list of some of the things we learned from this process.
Thank you. We're going to have plenty of time for discussion, and especially certain points that you feel you didn't make. I'm sure we'll be able to weave that into the discussion. So right now, George Santangelo from NIH Office of Portfolio Analysis. Ways to measure impact without the JIF.
Hi. So I'm going to go walk you through a data-driven process for understanding impact, and there won't be a lot of math, I promise. But using data and developing artificial intelligence to assist with decision-making and to assess research productivity. Let's see. Okay. So our group in the Office of Portfolio Analysis, my team there, we've been doing this work since 2011. And early on, we started work on developing a way to measure bibliometric, what's sometimes called citation impact. We don't like the word impact associated with citations. And so we call it influence, because we do think that citations measure influence. And so we developed this normalized metric. Everyone knows who works with citations knows that you have to time normalize and field normalize. And so we developed a method to do that and published it in PLOS Biology. And there was a follow-up response to a critique from someone who had issues with the method. And that conversation continues. And our attitude is at NIH is we need something for biomedical research for assessing influence, the influence of publications, that works. And so if somebody has a better way to do it than we've come up with, we'd be happy to adopt it and call it the relative citation ratio. We're not proud. But then I've also published a perspective in molecular biology of the cell that focused on the need to go beyond influence, right? So obviously, counting the number of papers, most of what NIH produces, of course, in advancing scientific knowledge that improves human health, that's our mission, is focused on, is our outputs associated with publications in some way. But we need to, and citations are an easy way of understanding, ranking, quantifying in some way, as we I continue to emphasize influence. But we want to go beyond that because that doesn't take us to improving human health. It arguably does take us to how fast are we advancing scientific knowledge. And so we worked on a second way to measure productivity. And obviously from the NIH perspective, that means tracking translational progress, bench to bedside. So how fast is the knowledge moving into the clinic for work on humans? And so that means characterizing clinical trials, citations of publications by clinical trials. It also, to some extent, because a lot of it involves technology transfer, involves characterizing patents and citation by patents. And Griffin Weber at Harvard had developed this approach using medical subject heading terms called the triangle of biomedicine. I don't have time to go into great detail about the method. We just published it a couple weeks ago in PLOS Biology, so the method is there. And we also have a web tool, I'll talk about it in a minute, that is publicly available. But it allows you to heat map on a triangle. The different vertices are based on the medical subject headings, as I said, and molecular and cellular science is at the left bottom vertex, and animal research is at the right, and human research is at the top. Griffin put human on the right, but we're at NIH, so we put human at the top. So that's a second way. We used a machine learning approach to develop something called app score. So that's app stands for approximate potential to translate. So we can predict accurately whether papers that are published are going to be cited by clinical trials or guidelines. So they are going to lead to what we think of as shots on goal, right? Clinical trials, most of them are not successful, but obviously the successful ones are in there in the mix. And so knowing what the movement of the information, the knowledge flow from fundamental research and other studies into the clinic and being able to predict that is, we think, very powerful. Okay, so I mentioned the web tool, so it's called iCite, I-C-I-T-E. We just released version 2.0. Version 2.1 had the, version 1 had the relative citation ratio values and the way we calculate that. And version 2 has 3 modules. The influence module is the old iCite, the old version. The translation module has this triangle of biomedicine and app scores and the other kinds of measures of bench to bedside translation that I mentioned. And then the third module is an open citation collection. And this was very important to us. In the interest of transparency, it's really critical to make the raw data available so that people wouldn't have to rely on us to calculate relative citation ratios. We want to be able to give them the raw data so they can do it themselves. They can also calculate these data independently of us. That's a great way to check on quality. We get lots of feedback from folks when there are issues with the data that we correct quickly. And so that's important. An important facet, but it's also important to leverage folks outside of NIH to do this kind of work, the kind of work that we're doing inside NIH, not only as a check on us, but as potential collaborators. There's nothing like healthy competition to move things forward. So lowering the barrier to entry by making the data open and available, and we're talking about biomedical data here, so there are actually more citations in Web of Science in our database for PubMed. So we're focused on PubMed, but for PubMed, we have a better representation than anything else out there. And it's free of charge. Okay, then we're also doing a huge amount of work on this very nasty problem. I didn't realize at the beginning how bad it would be, but so we're not quite finished yet, but disambiguating drug and lead compound names. Disambiguation simply means you've got lots of different names for the same compound, and you need to disambiguate that. You need to merge it into one. So it's really just data cleaning, which anybody who works with big data will tell you 95% of the work is drudgery, is data cleaning, data wrangling. And so that's what we're doing here and incorporating the Orange Book and the other FDA data in understanding the development of drugs and devices and connecting that up. So you can see the transition here that I'm talking about, advancing scientific knowledge, moving it into the clinic, eventually having success at FDA-approved drugs and devices, for example. So tracking all of that, having all of the data be interoperable and be able to measure what the productivity is and make predictions where possible, as we can do with translational progress. By the way, we can calculate these app scores within 2 years, still lagging indicator, but within 2 years after papers are published, we can tell you the likelihood that they'll eventually be cited by a clinical trial or guideline. Okay, and the last thing, I don't have time to talk about these. I'll talk about a little bit more in the little time I have remaining on eyesight in these two approaches. But we are also working on emergence, so trying to understand and ideally predict what's on the horizon, what's emerging, and we're actually having good success with that. So, oh, yeah, that's right, there's one more thing, and that is we published a paper in Science Advances also a couple weeks ago. It was just a coincidence that those came out almost exactly the same time, but on a content analysis, deep learning method for detecting overlapping proposals, and we have a process, we're working with NSF to be able to share data across funders, across agencies, without sharing proprietary data, and that's quite complicated, and again, I'm not going to go into that in great detail. But so just very quickly, the publicly available web tool, Eyesight 2.0, tracking influence and translational impact. We are comfortable calling it translational impact. Here are our development partners, and these folks, most of them are power users of Eyesight 1.0, and we've gotten a lot of help from them. We're very grateful for their assistance in beta testing the 2.0 before the release that was a couple of weeks ago, concomitant with the publishing of the paper. So just very quickly, a couple of screenshots. This is the influence. You see there are 3 tabs. This is the influence tab. This is the development of cancer immunotherapy. Here's the paper in 1996 that won the Nobel Prize for Jim Allison. He's HHMI, isn't it, Jim Allison? Probably. And some of the other papers in this area. And so you can see there are summary statistics up at the top, and you can go to the tool and check it out yourself. You can do searches just like you can in PubMed, or put in PMIDs from a PubMed search, and PMIDs are PubMed IDs, and get the data. And then the translation module has the triangle biomedicine. It's actually a plot of those same papers. You can go back and forth between these, look at the open sites module to look at the raw citation data. And the tool allows you to actually play movies that show you the temporal progress. And if I can do that here, I'll show you what that looks like. So you see the fundamental research was done in the mid-90s, and then as time went on, it moved into the clinic. This region here we call the Valley of Death because it's very sparse, and it really does represent the pain point in going from fundamental research up into the clinic. And here's where the clinical trials happened in the early teens, and that led to successful FDA approval and has saved a lot of lives, and there's a lot of ongoing research on this topic and further drug development. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
David Mellor from the Center for Open Science.
Thank you for doing that for me. And the timer's going. And let me just get right into it. We've been living with these espoused norms of how science is supposed to be occurring for decades now. Robert Merton in 1942 laid out an ideal process for what scientists might all agree upon. And in the interest of time, let me just summarize. The left side of these norms of scientific process are don't avoid appeals to authority, make sure that the evidence speaks for its own self, and make sure the evidence is transparently available. Anderson, who conducted a survey on this that I'll get to in a moment, added a norm of scientific process should be the quality of the research as opposed to the quantity of research outputs. So we can, these of course were espoused, but do the scientific community abide by them? So Anderson and colleagues evaluated, asked researchers at different career stages, tell me the degree to which you agree, agree with these scientific norms. Is this how science should actually take place? And the vast majority of them agreed, yes, I think I agree with these norms of scientific practice. Some folks weren't quite sure, and a small minority said, no, those counter norms are the way science should progress. Don't tell me what you think should happen, but tell me what you actually do. And still, a pretty big majority say, yes, I abide by these principles of transparently sharing my evidence, not appealing to authority, and let me just say, abiding by open scientific practices. A fair group said they weren't quite sure. They did a little bit of both, and a slightly larger, but still noticeable minority said, no, I don't do that. And Aaron presented this research technique earlier yesterday, so I'm glad that it's catching on because it's a really enlightening process. Don't tell me what you do, but tell me what the folks down the hall or the folks in the other department or the folks at the other universities do. And of course, all of those jerks are only in it for themselves. They don't transparently share their evidence. They appeal to their own reputations or to the reputations of others. And this is a huge barrier to culture change. This is the ice wall in Game of Thrones. But we wouldn't be here if folks in this room didn't recognize that. So knowing that there is this problem that it feels like everybody around me is just in it for themselves, and I'm just here trying to do my good science, how do we shift this culture? It's a real big problem. Again, I don't have too much time to go into this, but let me assert, and then ask me for data later, that one of the big problems that results from this disconnect between scientific ideals and scientific practices, or what we feel the practices are around us, are that the process of science is messy. That's a given. Making discoveries, exploring through, looking for unexpected trends or discoveries is by its nature a very messy process. But we are forced to present it using a more simplistic, idealized version of the scientific research workflow. And that does a disservice to both types of research. If you're looking for discoveries, looking for completely unexpected things, the messy sausage is what the message should be, but we are incentivized, encouraged, and in some cases forced to present it as if they were this clean, a priori research confirmation process. And it does a disservice to that process because that is, when it is presented honestly, the process of confirmations, that's deemed as being too boring to fund or to get published. So we exist in a research culture, and what DORA does really well, and what the working groups, if they exist after this, should continue to emphasize are specific steps that individual stakeholders should be taking, knowing that in the center of this are researchers responding to all of these signals and incentives that are around them. What we focus on at the Center for Open Science is the work that is not the tip of the iceberg. The tip of the iceberg is the final research publication that gets published and disseminated, which is just, as has been said many times before me, is a very superficial summary of all the work that actually took place. All the work that actually took place were the a priori hypotheses that may have existed or may not have, the research materials generated to conduct that study, the analytical code used to analyze the data, and of course, the underlying raw data. This is the evidence that underlies any credible assertion. And this is the evidence, and these are the materials that deserve evaluation. So when we say it's necessary to evaluate research on its own merit, I would say that's impossible without increased transparency into the process that occurred to generate that conclusion, represented roughly by these three things. So if we're going to change a research culture, there is a roadmap for how it's done. It's been done before, it happens all the time. Roger Evers in the 60s talked about the diffusion of innovations, how new technologies are adopted by early adopters and innovators being the first, a big group in the middle taking on these new activities, and then laggers at the end, eventually come kicking and screaming. We at the Center for Open Science take inspiration from that and think about which of these different activities are going to be possible for these different groups at different times. So building basic infrastructure is something that the innovators, the very early adopters, will use, whether it works well or not. But that's not going to cut it for most folks. So improving how that happens, building communities to make sure that it's folks can see that these are normal practices, making sure there's additional recognition and credit given for these activities when they do occur. And then finally at the top, make it required if you want it to happen. And again, this will account for the players that we know are going to be responding at different times to these changing research cultures, because that's what we want to be doing. One way to identify when norms are changing and to showcase what your peers are doing is just making sure that those activities are visible so that you can see when it happens. The peer pressure can be applied, or just the use of examples of seeing how other people have done it. This is an example of the latest issue of the journal Psychological Science, who don't have any mandates for sharing data or for pre-registration or for sharing research code or other materials. But the vast majority of articles these days have one or more of these activities taking place. Each one of those is a signal to a potential peer that, this is something I've done and it's something that we all value despite all the barriers to getting it done. And each one of those also provides, an example for somebody else to learn from. Registered reports is another initiative to try to make that clear distinction between what was a planned hypothesis test, what was actually discovered, and to address the well-known bias towards publication only of the most significant or novel effects. So traditionally, peer review occurs after most of the project is done. There's no chance to address fatal flaws in the research design. Peer review can be moved earlier on in the process to evaluate only the research questions, only the research methodology, and if they are deemed appropriate, they can be given a promise to publish regardless of outcome. They work. Let me just say that. And there are other ways that research funders and journals can work together to ensure that those processes are followed so that the research can be, the decision to make whether or not the research deserves to be funded and the research deserves to be published can occur simultaneously as well. So let me just end with my 30 seconds over. And I know this is obviously an oversimplification. We've recognized that. We want to evaluate research by its own merit, and what that takes is evaluating research only if it's transparently reported. These transparency indicators are honest indicators because they incentivize the type of behavior we want to be able to see. And it's aligned with those norms of scientific practice that are well espoused. And I'll just give a mention to Dan Morgan, who pointed out through conversation, two other points that these signals are immediately known. One of the big reasons that journal name is we latch onto that so much because it's the one thing we know about the research when it's immediately published. We know where it was published, despite the fact that that's not a good indicator of anything. And these are not meant to replace any other metric, but to complement them.
Thank you. All right, Ruth Schmidt, how to apply a user design approach to research assessment reform. Come on up.
So I realize I took a little bit of liberty with the title. Human-centered design has often sort of become a replacement for user-centered design in some ways because users makes it feel like you're kind of being designed at. It wouldn't be incorrect to say humanity-centered design is actually an even better way of saying this, because essentially when we're designing, we should be considering sustainability and longer-term implications. So you may be wondering who these two fellows are up here. And it's funny, over lunch we had a slight conversation around postmodernism, which probably is not what I expected to get in a meeting of scientists. But there was an article, a paper by Claude Lévi-Strauss, who was a structural anthropologist in 1962, called The Savage Mind. And in that paper, he designated these sort of two personas about problem solving. Our fellow on the left over here is what he called an engineer, which is very much a scientific way of approaching content. So very much about theory and how do we evolve sort of ways of thinking that's grounded in structure and then applied. And he considered this the modern approach, so just so you all know. On the other side here, we had what he called the bricoleur, which is a French word, and it's essentially, the way I sort of talk about him, he's kind of like MacGyver. Scotch tape, chewing gum, kind of puts ideas together, a little bit more scrappy, bottom up, sort of figuring out what to do at that time. And you could argue that's more of a design-centered approach. I would say that these two fellows just need to talk to each other more, because it's really not about one being right and the other being wrong. It's really about appropriateness and sharing so that we can get to really solving problems. So from a design point of view, there are just kind of three high-level things I wanted to talk about. One is that we do tend to use what's called a generative research approach. And I use the word research, I realize, in this audience lightly, because you would not consider what I do research necessarily. I do a lot of talking to people and observing folks. But the reason that generative research can be useful is because it helps us to figure out what it is we're actually solving for. We're not necessarily thinking what's the right solution at the very beginning, so it can help us to develop good hypotheses. We can also think, and this has come up a few times already, about the unit of analysis. Sometimes we are looking at an individual. Sometimes we're looking at a community or a family or a whole system. So the way that we think about the unit of analysis can impact, again, what problems we want to be looking at, what we want to be solving for, and what solutions are meaningful. We often talk in the design field about understanding orthodoxies, which is just essentially kind of the way things work around here, which we all tend to become somewhat blind to when we're part of these communities all the time. But actually taking the concrete effort to step through and sort of undo and unpack what our expectations are and our orthodoxies can also be valuable to help us question what is it that actually needs to be true and what doesn't. And then finally, the idea of precursors and analogs is another way that we expand our thinking. It came up in some of the conversations earlier, for example, yesterday, I believe, about ways in which other organizations, even this morning, what do other organizations do? It's incredibly useful to look outside our own fields. You know, sports sometimes worries about how to balance quantity and quality, for example. In financial services, right? There are all sorts of things out there that can be helpful to bring into our thinking about what we do. So that's kind of one, just this idea that we can diverge before we converge as a problem-solving mechanism. Another way that we can think about it, I just cherry-picked a couple of things. Obviously, there are many, many things that are currently sort of incorrect or wrong, biases that we bring about research assessment. What's measured matters. The fact that certain quantifiable things are easy to compare and rank, and that's appealing. It can save time. Even sort of taking the top search results, which helps us, starts to perpetuate, people on top stay on top. So we can look at this from two perspectives. This is another design approach, where we can look at the systems view, right? Looking from the top down, incredibly useful and important. We can understand things like power dynamics and current processes and structures and kind of what holds these things in place. It can also help us to look at, for example, and understand what are some of the underlying root causes for why things are happening the way they do. We've definitely talked at this meeting about unintended consequences as well. What happens when systems change and what happens as a result. And the idea of leverage points. We don't have time to get into systems design, but for example, one of the things I do at work is to start to spec out enormous kind of flowcharts about different players. We all have individual slices of knowledge, right? Being able to see across an entire system can help us see where can small leverage points make a big difference. Design also looks very carefully at the human side of things. And the reason that this is latent user needs is because sometimes you can't trust what people say, but you can start to understand kind of what are some of the underlying things that speak to their identity, that speak to what they value, right? We've talked about values at the institutional level, but individual people value things as well. Sometimes it's about getting tenure. That's a strong thing, but it's also about being credible and sort of looking smart in front of my peers and making sure I'm part of the right conversations. All of these are interesting things we can learn. Misconceptions are super interesting. We don't always agree, and sometimes it's not until we probe that we understand that somebody's walking around with a very different perspective than we think they might. And we've talked significantly at this meeting already about just the variety of definitions, right? What does impact mean? That can mean very, very different things to different folks, but unless we start talking to people and understanding, we're going to have a very hard time aligning or solving problems because we're going to be looking at the same thing. And then finally, this is a framework which I've been using for many years in sort of design and behavioral work, thinking in terms of humans and behaviors and their impact in systems. So just really quickly to kind of walk through this, if we think about context, this is about the human context. If we understand what people think about themselves, what values they have, and even though it sounds soft, kind of what is the story they tell themselves about what's right? That sense of fit, not just cultural fit, but is this the right thing for me? We're all kind of narrative human beings. That's the way we understand things typically. So this is not a replacement for data by any means, but it's a way that we can start to dig into what is it that people believe and want and understand. That can help us to solve for them much better. We also, from a behavioral standpoint, we know that cognitive effort makes a huge difference in what people do or don't do. So how do we reduce cognitive effort when it's important? Simplifying things. We've talked a couple of times about ways to provide structure. That provides a sense of understanding about what looks good and what's right. And also salience, right? What's important to me at that moment, or even the fact that a journal that's really important in my head, I immediately use that as a proxy for others. That takes the place, right, of other evidence. And that can be useful, but it can also get in the way. Uncertainty is a huge barrier to human understanding. And we all face uncertainty constantly, both in our personal lives, but also in professional lives. So understanding what reference points are being held, how do we understand what people are holding themselves to and what do they compare themselves against, can be very useful as we're both assessing and being assessed. We've talked a number of times about concreteness, concrete examples, concrete reference points of what I know looks good or what's right. What is it that I can use as sort of a touch point? And the trade-offs that people make. It's very difficult to know. The future is abstract. We don't know what's going to play out, but the more that we understand what those potential choices are, it means that, again, we can start to design for people much better because we know what they're trading off. And then finally, putting this to action, right? People can know they should do the right things and want to do the right things, and they just don't. That's true in many cases. It's true in our own personal lives, again, as well as professionally. So understanding where is their barriers, or where are their barriers, where is their friction, and where can it be removed or even put in place if things are happening too quickly. Ownership, incredibly important as well. So the more that we take ownership or give ownership onto somebody, it means they hold themselves accountable towards doing different things. That, again, can be a motivating factor for behavior. And then finally, incentives, I almost don't need to talk about because we've been discussing that extensively. And just as I happened to see this on Twitter a few days ago, and it just seemed so relevant, I couldn't not include it. You know, it's about getting information out there. It's not necessarily about journals. And, you know, if you can get a Nobel Prize for it, all the better, I suppose. Thanks.
Okay, as I said before, our next speaker is going to be speaking to us remotely, Lou Woodley, and she's going to be talking about how systems thinking applies to research assessment reforms. It may take us a moment or two to get
I think
her
hopefully
up,
we should
but
be
it
good.
looks like it's happening.
Okay, excellent. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much to the tech folks for making this work. So I'm Lou Woodley. I'm director of the Centre for Scientific Collaboration and Community Engagement. And I'm going to be talking this afternoon about systems thinking, so really giving an introduction to what systems thinking is, and then talking through two tools that we can use to take a systems thinking approach when we're tackling complex issues such as research assessment reform. But before we dive into systems thinking itself, what I'd like to do is really start where we are and start by considering why is it that change and culture change is so hard? Why is it so challenging to try and find solutions to things like research assessment? We often describe these kinds of cultural change problems as wicked problems. And those are problems that have a requirement to address the whole system. So we don't necessarily find a single point solution, but instead we have to identify multiple underlying structural elements. And that means that we need to make more than one intervention. So if we only target a single issue, then we're unlikely to be effective. And that those underlying structural elements are all likely to be interconnected. And so this often makes me think of a game of whack-a-mole where we set off with good intentions and a big hammer, and we chase after the thing that we think we've identified as needing fixing. We run after it and whack the mole and then turn around and behind us, another mole has popped up because we didn't understand that the system was in an equilibrium, and trying to put one intervention in place merely results in something else cropping up behind us. So if things are operating in a system, then where does systems thinking come in? How can that help us? So systems thinking is an approach that encourages us to take a more holistic or systemic view of how different factors relate to one another within a whole. And so the key here is the word relate. So once we have that list of the different components that we think are at play, it's really about understanding how those things are influencing one another. So that encourages us to move away from a focus on individual events or on simplistic cause and effect scenarios, so A influences B, and instead to zoom out and see what is happening with C, D, and E, and maybe things that are upstream of A as well. So that allows us to see multiple components in relationship to one another all at once. And that can indicate inputs that we may have missed when we were too closely zoomed in just to A and B. And it may also make it easier to understand any delays that we're seeing in the system, or indeed any escalations when things are occurring more quickly than we might have predicted. And so, as Ruth sort of hinted at, that can suggest points of leverage, so where our interventions might be more effective. And so really, the more that we start to think about things in a systems perspective, the more we might understand where it is that we can actually be more effective at intervening. So how can we adopt a more systems perspective in the work that we do? So Donella Meadows, who really wrote the primer on systems thinking, says that there are actually 3 conceptual shifts that are required. So first of all, the first shift is to start to observe the big picture. So zoom out from focusing only on our part of the system to seeing more of the whole. The second thing that Meadows underlines is personal responsibility. So often we know that we're dealing with a wicked problem or a systems problem when we start to see blame being given, and we start to see things like lack of resources being blamed for the inability to get the results that we want. And so the emphasis here is actually on personal responsibility. So moving from hoping that somebody else is going to make the first move to identifying where we ourselves have agency in order to start exerting some of the changes that we want to see. And then finally, the third thing to do to get to a systems perspective is to put an emphasis on systems structure. So to move from focusing on the top level things that we can observe, the individual events, the fires, the crises that may be grabbing our attention, and to go deeper below the surface to understand the structures that are causing these specific events. So with that in mind, I promised a couple of tools to help us adopt a systems approach when thinking about complex problems. And the first of these are systems archetypes. So systems archetypes are really a way of visualizing how it is that different components in a system may be playing out together. And so Peter Senge and colleagues identified 12 of these common archetypes that they see in systems of various different types. And so the one that we're going to look at here today is one of the simpler ones. This is known as success to the successful, or you might know it as the rich get richer effect. And what we see in the center here is the allocation of resources. So if we imagine that A here represents one research group A in an institution, and B represents a different research group, then maybe the institution has some internal funding that it's allowed to allocate on perhaps an annual basis. Now, if Group A comes and has already had some kind of prior success, then they may be more likely to receive resources from that central fund. That may then result in a virtuous cycle whereby they're more successful again, which means when the next funding round comes, they again receive the funding. So no surprises there, that's the virtuous cycle. And then B, on the other hand, is in a vicious cycle or a downward spiral because they miss out the first time and the gap between the two groups increases. Well, so far so simple. This doesn't seem to be especially nuanced, but where these systems archetypes become helpful is allowing us to identify these leverage points and really helping us to ask questions about what it is that we're valuing in this system and whether it's really set up the way that we intended. So, for example, why was this system here constructed for there to be just one winner? Was that really what we intended? Or actually, were we really hoping to see some collaboration? So we may not be able to increase that central pot of funding, but we might be able to change the way that we allocate the funding such that we ask for different labs to apply together for interdisciplinary grants to encourage collaboration. Or we state even to avoid competition that a group that's been successful in year one has to sit out the round of funding in the following year to give a different group a chance. So these are how the archetypes work. The second tool that I wanted to briefly walk us through is the iceberg model, or the systems thinking iceberg. This is quite different from David's iceberg that he presented earlier. This one really enables us to take an event that we can see on the surface, so something that we've observed happening, and really ask a series of questions to get down to what the underlying structures and beliefs might be that have caused that event to happen. So the idea is you start at the top of the iceberg, and say we take an event like we wanted our institution to diversify its faculty, but actually when we look at the report on how we're doing with that, we see that in fact the number of underrepresented minorities of our institution is actually declining. So the next question that you ask is, well, what are the patterns and trends? What's happened over time? And we might see that this downward trend has occurred as of 3 years ago, and that prior to that, we seem to be doing okay. So then we ask the question, well, what happened 3 years ago? What's influenced this trend? That might indicate that there was a particular conflict, a particular event that got some coverage that was never really publicly resolved. And so that bad feeling has just remained out there in public. And there is now a reputation for the institution that it's not actually a welcoming place for various minorities to apply. And so then when we ask what the mental models are in place, what are the underlying assumptions and beliefs? Well, externally, folks may look at the institution, may read the various publicity about it and assess that it's not actually a place that they feel comfortable applying to. And people within the institution may not feel that it's somewhere that they're willing to recommend, or perhaps that they even want to stay at further. So instead of taking a knee-jerk reaction, which might be just to do more marketing and communications to try and increase our recruitment, this identifies that we've actually got some deeper challenges to address in order to actually meet the targets that we've set ourselves. So those are the two models that I wanted to present. If that's piqued your interest about systems thinking, there's 3 books here that I recommend and a website that really unpacks all of those 12 archetypes that I've mentioned, and you can find out further there. Thank you.
Okay, and now if all the speakers could come up and take a seat. Yes, you should put that back on. Great. Let's start off with some questions for the speakers. Questions?
Thank you. I specifically have a question about the NIH's attempts to generate new metrics to assess citations. Does it take into account at all the gender bias that exists in citation rates? No. Is there, is there any attempt to correct for that, to take that into account?
Right. No, it's a great question, because this is important. This is important. There we go. Okay, there we go. It's a very important point, and for that reason, we built in a benchmarking step in the calculation. So currently, the ratio is benchmarked to NIH-funded publications. So 1.0, an RCR of 1.0 is a typical NIH-funded publication. But any benchmark can be used. We built this in because there are use cases for comparing low resource countries and science in different contexts. And one could develop a benchmark, gender-based benchmark. We hadn't really thought of that. But any kind of phenomenon that one wanted to explore or adjust for in the data, that is possible with the tool.
So, I mean, I guess a follow-up to that is that are those benchmarks, since you have multiple tabs to evaluate the relative contributions to different aspects of the influence ratio and all those, can you have multiple benchmarks so that people can actually, so that things like access to resources, issues like gender can actually be evaluated in the eyesight? Because the way that it's currently represented, if you can benchmark that, it would be interesting to provide the data for that.
Yeah, it's probably too complicated to do it in the tool because there are so many different aspects one might want to adjust for. But that's the reason for making the raw data available to people, because then anyone can develop, we're happy to help folks if they want to work with us to address issues like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Sandy's got a question. Throw it.
Also Boyana over here.
Throw it.
Boyana. There's also.
There's water in that cup. A question about big science, which is essentially what you're talking about, where there's a big, hairy, audacious goal that a lot of groups are tackling, and there were a lot of P50 grants, the Signal Alliance, and the Structural Biology Initiative, all of these large kinds of funded things. Now we have private enterprises, Google and Allen Institute and whatnot. And I'm wondering what is the literature? You were getting to some of that. What are the new mechanisms of herding cats, and what are prototypical independent labs into combined big, hairy, audacious goal, and what are the examples of success in that enterprise?
Yeah, so I think what has been working is this idea of modeling the research and the outcomes and the ultimate impacts that you're aiming at in some kind of a theory of change, and often in nested theories of change. So at the project scale, you can imagine and have a fairly detailed map of how you expect the research to contribute to some kind of a change process, and then how that is expected to link with other processes at a higher scale. It's possible then to do empirical analysis at the project scale. The trick is then at the scaling up. There's a lot of sort of relying on logic models and indicators that change is happening, but the attribution is difficult to impossible. But that's as good as I've seen so far, and beyond that, I'm not sure. It's super challenging. Yeah.
Any success stories that you could describe?
So this CGIR exercise has successes and failures. It's a mixture, and it's still evolving. But I think the biggest success is in the culture change that has happened. The actual measurement and being precise about what are we actually achieving is quite difficult. But what I've seen, and this is anecdotal, but I've seen it quite a lot and a lot of good examples of scientists starting to think differently about how they do their work, how they ask their questions in the first place, how they engage with other actors in the system. And what I didn't get a chance to really get to is that some of the the structural changes that have happened in the individual organizations is that they've recognized that there's multiple functions that have to be performed in order to achieve what we say we're trying to achieve, and the scientists can't take responsibility for that themselves entirely, and so you need a team and you need a structure, and so it gets into some of this science of team science and how do we organize ourselves so that all of the things that need to be done are being done. So the successes so far are in attitudes and culture, but also becoming more deliberate and explicit about planning so that it will be possible to test and improve as we progress, I think.
Hi, so I'm always interested in sort of theoretical models of how things might look, so I appreciated the last couple of speakers, and I wondered, I don't know if Lou can still hear us, but maybe if Ruth and Lou could comment a little bit on, I mean, you sort of presented ways of thinking, but Ruth, you've been here sort of hearing the quandary that we're facing, and Lou, I know you've been at AAAS a long time, so you probably are familiar with research assessment. Taking what you study, what would be sort of the first thing you would do to, in your case, human-centered, the systems design, kind of look at to tackle the problem that we're facing here?
So there are a couple of things. I mean, part of it is just acknowledging how complicated it is. Clearly, that's part of what we're here to do. So having, I forget which slide it was in particular, but first figuring out, talking and understanding more from a broad range. So we're starting to get ideas out here. This may be a somewhat self-selecting group, so one of the things that we would typically do is to also understand kind of what is the range of perspectives. And again, the type of research I do is not necessarily the same kind of way. We don't necessarily look for statistical significance to learn. What we're tending to do is to look at new ways to understand the problem. And I think actually sessions like this are starting to be almost a proxy for that, right? Like a lot of what we're doing here is surfacing up, but you'd want to be able to get a holistic view both from a systems perspective and from the ground up. So I'd say like the first thing to do is just understand, get a grasp on what that problem is. We then also typically, I didn't talk about it specifically here, but the development of principles to then figure out, because you're not going to either create a completely systemic perfect solution, but you also don't want to create solutions for every individual place. So one thing that design often does is to kind of abstract out. So once we start to learn things and we understand kind of what are things that we would say kind of have to be true of good solutions. And I realize that's a little bit of a, I don't want to say anti-science, but it may not be quite as traditionally a science approach to come in, bring abstraction in midway through. But that's actually been shown to be quite helpful as well, because then it gets people on board, right? We can start to align on what it is that we're trying to do, but then also get more and more concrete once we have principles about, well, what does it look like in different places? What does that actually sort of test out? And the third quick thing I would say is prototyping, which is a very different type of testing. We don't always have to collect all the data in the world to know that something needs changing or to know that something works. One design technique is to do what is called iterative prototyping. So let's try things. Let's quickly learn from what we may want to test and get immediate and quick feedback and iterate in a tight cycle way, just to be able to test ideas more quickly besides trying to figure out the perfect answer and then moving from there. So that would be some.
Lou, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, that all makes a lot of sense. I would also say the interesting thing about working with the systems archetypes is that they don't operate in isolation. So one of the advantages that you can get by lining them up side by side is this understanding that there isn't usually kind of a single solution to these complex problems. So you might use one archetype, find your leverage point, change that, and realize that actually what's happened now is that another archetype has revealed itself because there's something else in the system that you haven't quite seen. So really, having a grasp of the different archetypes as tools and how they can interplay with each other can be really helpful for understanding the full complexity of what's going on.
Other questions?
So the lack of open citation databases, I think, have been a big impediment to creating new metrics. I'm really excited to see iSight come out. I'm curious where that there might be gaps in this. Where do the citations come from, and are there going to be differences in metrics based on iSight databases versus the global citation indexes?
Right. So the first limitation is that the data are completely focused on biomedical research, so it's PubMed, though we do have a plan to incorporate preprint server data. Increasingly, it's important for example, not only bioarchive, but archive, because data science is becoming a huge part of biomedical research. The citation data come from all over, Crossref and PubMed Europe, PubMed Central has a lot of citation data. So in my office, our team, we're data sponges. We take it for anywhere we can get it. To answer your first question about coverage, it does get a little bit less good before 2010. So but since 2010, we've got the best representation out there. Yeah.
Thank you.
There was another question, Stephen.
Question for Ruth. Really enjoyed your talk, but we're sort of 24 hours into a meeting and my brain is full, so I'm going to have to sort of really go back and think about the slides. But I was really taken by the idea of learning from adjacent spaces and thinking about other ways that organizations, attack and solve problems. And I've been also much impressed by the work of Margaret Heffernan, who's done a lot of sort of analysis of the flaws of thinking about how competition is the way to always find the best solutions or the best people to do things. So, can you think of concrete examples that might transfer to the academy? And, I do think there's probably lots of things that we can learn from the commercial sector, for example, but in a commercial environment, it's pretty easy to measure success, okay? It's the bottom line. Are you in the black or are you in the red? And in academia, our measures of success are far more diverse, and I think, one of the things we're trying to wrestle with here is developing the capacity to recognize different forms of success. So are there barriers, therefore, in transferring valuable lessons into the academy?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I would say one of the other things that I would kind of add to this idea of precursors, analogs, looking outside, is that we rarely find a perfect analog sort of encapsulated in one place. And oftentimes it can actually come in sort of unusual, like when I was sort of half joking when I said sports is a somewhat interesting place, because we actually do have certain similarities in that there's broad competition. It's often individual, and yet you're part of a collective. Obviously not in every one, but in some cases there is this balance of how do we judge kind of the quality of what one is doing with the very quantifiable. So I'm not saying that that is the place to look. But sometimes sort of looking further outside from what we expect even. So it may come from other, the short answer is I don't know if I have the perfect one right now. But there are also, education is a very broad area. So there may be other, rather than just looking at kind of at the institutional level when it comes to sort of postdoc and up, there may actually be interesting educational analogs which exist in other places. We can also look outside of countries, right? Because one of the things that's nice about having an international collection of folks is that we can actually see different examples from a variety of places, even within our own field. But also, yeah, just the reminder, I guess, that it's not just about looking for kind of a perfect example to pull in, because that's very rarely the case. But sometimes it can just be a hint of something, right? Like what are different ways in which collaboration has been rewarded over competition? There are many examples that exist for that in a variety of different disciplines. Not necessarily going to be the exact plug and play, but it can mean that we can start to get inspired by, something that we wouldn't have thought was possible. And yes, completely still being realistic about kind of the viability and feasibility concerns, which I know have been raised here a couple of times already, that we're not suddenly going to magically plant, a solution and not recognize funding implications. But yeah, I will think about a perfect example and a more concrete one. But as an exercise, I think it is sort of more broadly useful to really, we all get into our own silos, right, about what it is that we see in the examples we see. So part of the exercise that's valuable, I think, is partly in finding a good example and partly just sort of getting inspired by what are other things that we hadn't necessarily or wouldn't have thought otherwise.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank all the speakers.